Welcome. So we moved in the last session in Charbagh from the center of the arts and learning in ancient India at Nalanda. And we're now coming very properly forward 1,800 years, or certainly 1,500 years, to Awadh and Lucknow. Today, Lucknow is a provincial capital, but in the 18th century, when Delhi was being devastated by successive armies coming down from Afghanistan and up from the Deccan, it became a major haven of the arts, of learning, of painting, of music, and of pleasure. The art historian Stuart Carey Welsh put it very nicely when he said it was a mixture of 1970s Tehran, Monte Carlo, and Glyndebourne, which is a very nice encapsulation. And I think it's very easy to forget just how magnificent it was. The first ever war correspondent, William Howard Russell from the Times, who's covering the demise of Lucknow in 1857, watching the bombardment of this magnificent city just before it went down, wrote, "Not Athens, not Rome, not any city I have ever seen appears to me so striking and beautiful as this. The sun playing on the gilt domes and spires, the exceeding richness of the vegetation and forests and gardens reminds one sometimes of the Bois du Boulogne from the hill at Saint-Cloud." So this is this lost world which we're going to try and conjure up for you today. I'm very lucky to be joined by two wonderful scholars who've worked on Lucknow and on particularly the relation of Lucknow to the French. Ira, who spends much of her life in Paris and in London and has all sorts of exciting French connections, has been working wonderfully with the French sources as well as the other sources for Lucknow, and has produced this magnificent book, The Lion and the Lily, which came out this year, The Rise and Fall of Awadh. And I'm going first to ask her to go to the podium and talk to us for half an hour with slides. But we're going to then bring in wonderful G.S. Cheema, who has, in his retirement, given over to translating texts which were available only in French. And not for the English-speaking modern Indian audience. And his translations, both of the life of Shah Alam and of the Compte de Modave, which is a wonderful, wonderful source, has hugely enriched our access to the knowledge of 18th century India. So after Ira has talked to us, I am going to open the floor to all of us discussing what was so special about now. But first of all, Ira, set the scene for us. Lay out your float.
Thank you so much, William. Thank you for having me here, and thank you to JLF for this wonderful session where I'm able to talk about my book. I'm extremely excited to be able to use this pointer, but I'm not sure if it's working. It is? Oh, oops. Okay. You've gone too far. Here you go. So as William was saying, today we don't remember Lucknow for the great and glorious capital city of the province of Awadh that it once was. But you know, the loss of this history isn't accidental. It's not like you lose a pair of keys or your sunglasses. There was a very great concerted effort for us to forget all about Awadh, to destroy all of its manuscripts, its paintings, its great history and legacy. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about, is contested history. It's something that is still extremely relevant today, not just in India, but all over the world, really, as we come to terms, all of us, with our post-colonial countries and the end of empire and the effect it's had on all of us. I recently was listening to the radio in the UK, and there was this extraordinary figure that I heard where they said that some, I think 500,000, 500,000 children took history in high school last year at either GCSE levels or A levels. And guess how much chose to study contested histories? Out of 500,000 students. 2,000. Simply 2,000 chose to study, and it wasn't because of lack of interest from the children, it was because of fear from the teachers about what the parents, what their reactions might be if we choose to re-examine Churchill's role, for example, today, or to try and understand the causes of the Syrian, crisis, the Israeli war. So all these contested stories are something which are very sensitive, but really important for us to re-examine. And one of those, so that's really interesting to me here today, because through contested history that I have been examining, there are two great truths, let us say, that I have been able to uncover, I think, amongst other stories. The first is that there was never any resistance to British incursion into India. Instead, if you look at this closely, you see that right from the beginning, right from the 1760s, there are enormous resistances in all sorts of forms, tribal resistances, resistance from the rulers to British incursion, to British rule. The other interesting thing I have noticed as a woman, as a writer who is particularly interested in women's histories, is that the British imported a very strongly patriarchal notion. So all of our great women rulers, the women who had an impact on history, were often completely obliterated from the records. So that is another second really interesting thing that I hope to have brought out in my book, though it's not something I'm going to focus on terribly today in my presentation. As Willie was saying, I wanted to use some of the French sources to share with you this revelation to me that the French were very involved, obviously, in the whole of the 18th century, in their wars against Britain, because they were basically fighting a global Franco-British war to divide up the entire world along, these empirical lines. So, just to give you a quick sense of the sort of wars that were going on from the 1740s right through the entirety of the 18th century. And two in particular which have a huge consequence to the period I'm looking at in Awadh. One is in the middle, the 7 Years' War, which basically saw France defeated in Europe. And as a result of that, France changed her ambitions entirely in India. It was no longer a matter of territorial conquest, but it was a very specifically delineated aim to counter the British wherever they could in India, while bolstering the power of the local rulers who might be interested in standing up to the British. So we have Tipu Sultan of Mysore, Hyder Ali, and also, as I did discover, the nawabs of Awadh, who were very interested, who had understood clearly the importance of the British, that it was important to stand up to them, and they used the French as well in a number of ways. And another very important battle, of course, was the American War of Independence, which the French fought on the behalf of the Americans against the British. So that was one which had a huge psychological impact as well as a debilitating impact on Britain, because Britain incurred a huge war indemnity at the end of the American War of Independence. So what we have in the 18th century, this is a cast of characters from my books. And I wanted to show these to you because the idea in the 18th century of what constituted nationality, what was loyalty, how did you belong to a particular nation, was very different to what we understand it to be today. If you might forgive me for using a sporting metaphor, today we think in terms of people belonging to the Olympic team, for example. So you have one nation, you have one flag, one national anthem, and you are loyal to the country. But these people, these adventurers, these mercenaries, these soldiers, they really thought of themselves as members of the IPL team. So they would go to whoever paid them most, really, at the end of the day. It was often about money. So you have these characters. At the very top is Jean-Baptiste Gentil, and he was a Frenchman who fought alongside the Indians for the King of France. So he was quite clear in his loyalties, but most of the others were not. To his right, clockwise, is somebody that you may be familiar with, is Claude Martin. And though he was from Lyon, from France, spoke French, was a Catholic, spoke very poor English, he aligned himself with the British from the beginning because he saw that their star was on the rise. So he continued to be on the British side, but he operated in Awadh. Below him, looking a little bit menacing there in his turban, is René Madec, who was a simple soldier, and he fought alongside the Rohillas. So he had no real patriotism towards the French, despite being a Frenchman himself. At the bottom, you have Zoffany, the painter, Anglo-German painter who just took advantage of the great riches of Awadh. And up from him is Benoit de Boigne, who fought alongside the Marathas. So he was a Frenchman, but in a territory which at that time was the independent Duchy of Chambéry. So it hadn't yet integrated France. So he told the Marathas that I would rather not fight the British, but if I have to, I will. So you see all these notions of loyalty, patriotism, on who you're going to be fighting for, was all quite fluid at this time. And last, you have the interesting figure of Antoine Poulier. I write about him a lot in my book. Maya Jasanoff has called characters like him chameleons and grifters and shapeshifters, and that's really pretty accurate. Just to give you an idea of the sort of people we are interacting with in Awadh at this time. In the middle, of course, you have two of the important nawabs of this time. Nawab Shuja Ali Khan, the really tall nawab, and next to him, Asaf-ud-Daula, his son. So the story begins quite unexpectedly in Wales. Having read William's wonderful article once about Powell's Castle in Wales, where there's an extraordinary collection of Tipu Sultan memorabilia, I went there and found, apart from, of course, Tipu Sultan's amazing collection, this extraordinary painting which shows Clive being handed over, supposedly, the Diwani of Bengal after the Battle of Buxar. You are all familiar, of course, with the Battle of Plassey, which Robert Clive when he put in his own puppet on the throne. But then a very important battle was the Battle of Buxar of 1764, which has tended to be overlooked, even though it is a crucially important battle in which the Mughal forces under Shuja-ud-Daula, he was the commanding man at that time, the main character in Hindustan, being able to bring 200,000 soldiers to the battlefield. So he leads the Mughal armies against Clive and his cohorts, but they are defeated. The Mughal forces are completely defeated at the Battle of Buxar. This is a really important moment for Shuja-ud-Daula, who from this time onwards will never ally himself militarily with the Mughal emperor, Shah Alam II. And after this juncture, when the Mughals and Shuja-ud-Daula have lost the battle, Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor, is forced to hand over tax collecting rights to Robert Clive and the British East India Company, and they thereby get this huge source of money, wealth from Bengal and Bihar, the most important, most profitable areas at this time. Willie has, of course, written about it beautifully in The Anarchy. And there you have a painting of Robert Clive. You will be not surprised to learn that this very flattering portrait was painted by his cousin. He was indeed a great deal bigger than he is shown here, more florid and more sweating, I think. But there is also another side to this story, which is that there was a Frenchman involved in it. And here we have the same Jean-Baptiste Gentil I spoke to you about. So he came to India in 1751 and spent 30 years in India as an agent of the French King Louis XV. After a long peripatetic journey in the south, he ends up via Bengal at the court of Shuja-ud-Daula. And he has written records of his time in India, and he patronized paintings. In fact, he is one of the 3 big single sources of Mughal paintings and sponsored art at this time. His collection is really quite extraordinary in Paris. But what he does at this time, and he writes about, and we don't see these details anywhere else, is that he brings Shuja-ud-Daula to the table to parley with the British. Because after he's defeated, Shuja-ud-Daula is completely shattered. Until this time, he had never been defeated in battle. He was considered the single most powerful, courageous. He had great personal charisma. He was very beloved, and he could not believe that he had been defeated. It was a moment of real psychological angst for him. So he went on the run with his few remaining soldiers looking for allies. Of course, there were no allies to support him against the British once he had lost the battle. So Jean-Baptiste Gentil says that he brought Shuja-ud-Daula, explained to him that the British would not treat him badly, would allow him to keep his lands. Jean-Baptiste Gentil also speaks to the British, explains to them that Shuja-ud-Daula is a very well-regarded man in India and they cannot oppose him, and also they need a buffer between Bengal and Delhi. And so he brings them to the table, and a pact is signed, a treaty is signed. And we only find the details of this treaty in these paintings, in these records that Jean-Baptiste Gentil commissioned once he was in Awadh. And these wonderful little paintings, which are really the very beginnings of the Compte School of Art, which will become much more famous under British patrons later. But art historians like Mildred Archer have said that actually the very beginnings of company art can be attributed to Jean-Baptiste Gentil. Now, the very term company art can be problematic because it is giving all of the credit to the European men who are sponsoring the art. We need to bring back the painters who are all Indian, Mughal-trained artists. So, Indologist Jean-Marie Lafont has proposed calling this the Faizabadi School of Art because these were all commissioned, painted, produced in Faizabad, which was the capital of Awadh at this time. So, these extraordinary paintings here, you can see the little figures of Shuja-ud-Daula and Karnak. I think Karnak and Jean-Baptiste Gentil discussing the treaty. Here you can see the little figure of Jean-Baptiste Gentil presenting that line of soldiers. So these are French soldiers that he is bringing to Shuja-ud-Daula and saying, do you want to use these resources? Will you pay them and train your army according to French line, using French techniques? And of course, we know Shuja-ud-Daula agreed. So here we have that extraordinary moment shown in these tiny little Faizabadi type of art. Here, these are little close-ups from various portfolios, various folios of these manuscripts, and you see individual moments of this meeting between Shuja-ud-Daula, the British generals, with Gentil, very proud of his role. And he's written all of the information in French. He clearly intends this manuscript to be taken back to Paris with him when he goes back, presented to the king, so that he can glorify his role in this great moment of Indian history and give it to an elite audience of French people who will look at it carefully and admire all that he has done in India. So a very extraordinary document which lies today, a lot of it in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and which unfortunately hasn't been digitized as yet, so we don't really have easy access to it. So I'm very happy to be presenting it here to you, some of which I have used in my book as well. Another really interesting document he produced, which really deserves to get a little more credit than it did in its time, it was completely forgotten, is the Gentil Atlas. So he was the first to actually commission an atlas of India based on real geographical foundings and also based on an Indian source, the work of Abu al-Fazl, the great biographer of Akbar. So he uses a lot of the information from Abu al-Fazl's records, but he adds to it with his own knowledge of the countryside, his own knowledge of territories, of villages, of towns, of rivers, of forests. And these are the most detailed maps of this time in the 1770s ever produced. And yet the British ignored them completely. Everyone ignored them, and they were completely forgotten. At this time, you did not have maps being produced based on actual land surveys. So these sort of maps were actually, a very new innovation for its time. So an extraordinary thing. This Subah of Awadh that he is shown, he is also making a political statement, because on the sides you can see certain diagrams. And in this one, what you see on the bottom left, you can see a hunting scene. And the person who is hunting is Shuja-ud-Daula, and he is hunting a tiger. Now, hunting a tiger was considered an imperial prerogative at the time. It was something that kings and only the very elite were able to do. So Jean-Baptiste Gentil is telling us something about Shuja-ud-Daula. He is telling us something about his charisma, the power he commands, his standing in the country. So here you have that message being clearly relayed in a sort of code to those who can see this. Meanwhile, if you look at the corresponding Subah of Shah Jahanabad, which is actually Delhi, old Delhi at the time, this is where the Mughal emperor would have been ruling from. You will see the stark absence of Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. And what is Jean-Baptiste telling us about this? So Yuthika Sharma, a young scholar, has said that these are actually the first and only recordings of what was happening with the Mughal emperor at this time. Because after the Battle of Buxar, when the Mughal army is defeated, Shah Alam is not allowed to go back to Delhi, to his capital. He is kept by the British at the fort of Allahabad for almost 12 years, a virtual prisoner, unable to get back to his people, unable to get back to the entirety of his family, to his heirs, to the princes, and he is deeply miserable about this. So in this amazing folio from this atlas, you can see that all the accoutrements of his nobility are there. You have the parasol, you have his throne, you have all the alums and the standards, but the emperor is missing. Yet once again, a very fascinating political insight that Gentil is transmitting to us. Here is a small close-up. Where is the emperor, then you may ask? He is here in the Suba of Ajmer. Now, Ajmer is very important because there is the dargah here, a Sufi dargah that the Mughal emperors have always been extremely close and allied to this dargah from the time of Akbar, when he prayed for sons. He was not being able to have sons, and he makes a pilgrimage to the dargah at Ajmer. So it is a very powerful symbol for all Mughal emperors. And here, Jean-Baptiste Gentil has shown Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II actually present in Ajmer, getting the blessings of the Pirzada. So again, we are being told, here is the legitimate ruler of India. He is getting the blessings of the most powerful Sufi presence that there is at Ajmer Sharif. And here he is being blessed. So yet again, we can trace the career of Shah Alam II, who otherwise has been given a pretty hard shift, and he's pretty poorly done by. We remember him as this very tragic emperor, waiting later on, blinded, basically waiting for the end of his empire. But he was a young man once. He tried very hard to get back his throne. He tried to fight. He tried to gather armies under his name. So this Gentil album is one of the rare places where we do see his trajectory. Here we see what happens to Shah Alam II while he is in Allahabad, unable to get back to Delhi. He comes to Faizabad one day, and here we see this painting depicts that visit. He comes to Shuja-ud-Daula to plead with him, to say, please, will you gather a little bit of an entourage, a few soldiers for me to go back to Delhi? Because obviously these are dangerous times with the Marathas. He cannot just waltz into Delhi at this time. As Willie was explaining, Delhi is a very fractious area. The whole north of India is being fought over by all kinds of factions. So it's very dangerous for the emperor to go back on his own. So he comes to ask Shuja-ud-Daula. We see him here in his palanquin, followed by 4 of his sons. Again, Jean-Baptiste Gentil has written about this in great detail. But of course, Shuja-ud-Daula refuses. He doesn't want to have anything more to do with the militarily with Shah Alam II, though he greets him with great style, with great hospitality. Another picture of the same occasion showing how important this visit actually was for Shuja-ud-Daula, for Jean-Baptiste Gentil and the French, who clearly see Shah Alam II as the legitimate ruler of India. And throughout the 18th century, even after the 7 Years' War, the Governor General at Chandanagar, Chevalier, keeps trying to, he sends spies out all over India to try and get information to see if they can gather an army under the standards of Shah Alam II to win back Bengal and Bihar from the British. So here, a second folio showing that visit. We see him in the middle of the Anguri Bagh. And we also see very endearingly the figure of Jean-Baptiste Gentil himself, the man in the smart red coat, actually being introduced himself to Shah Alam II. So a very proud moment for this Frenchman, who clearly intends for this to be shown to Louis XV when he goes back to France. Jean-Baptiste Gentil writes that Shah Alam II gives him an offer and tells him, why don't you come and join me instead? And very wisely, Gentil demurs and stays with Nawab Shuja-ud-Daula instead. And this folio I find endlessly fascinating. It is an image of finally Shah Alam using the help of the Marathas, who finally come to him and say, we will take you back to Delhi, we will escort you back to Delhi. And this wonderful, wonderful image showing this long procession. In the foreground, there are actually some women. You will see that they are, I don't know if you can make it out, if it's sharp enough. They are women soldiers, so they were called the Urdu Begis, the women guards. So they are fully kitted out in fighting gear, but they are there to defend the elite women who are sitting either inside palanquins or upon elephants. And you see this whole line of soldiers, of noblemen, the imperial elephant, and all the imperial family who are going back to Delhi. This is a folio that I found really interesting because it actually shows the enthronement of Shah Alam once he's back in Delhi in 1772. And Yuthika Sharma, this young scholar, has said that these are the only places where we actually see the history of Shah Alam. What was happening to him? How did he get back? What happened when he got back to Delhi? And here we see the enthronement of Shah Alam II. Getting back to Delhi is extremely important for him. He's back in his capital city, the great Mughal capital city, from which he can actually claim to be a ruler. And we know how important this is because in 1857, all those soldiers of the uprising will come here, will come under the name of the ruling emperor to guide them and hold them together. So here you see this extraordinary ceremony being carried out at the bottom, which I have never come across. I don't know, William, if you have. So Gentil describes it, and he says the emperor writes out a few lines of the Quran on paper. He puts the paper into a bowl of water which contains a number of gold and silver rings, and then he distributes these rings to his noblemen the whole day long. I had never come across this ceremony, and he describes it as happening as part of these great festivities celebrating the return of Shah Alam. But Gentil also patronizes images of his time in Awadh. He spends 12 years in Faizabad with Shuja-ud-Daula, and this amazing painting shows the Muharram commemorations that are happening in Faizabad. And this was very important to me because I write a lot about how the nawabs at this time create a great culture of Shia resistance and of Shia commemoration to get together the citizens, all the people of Faizabad and later Lucknow will be, all of them are colored in the emotions of these festivities. And here we see one of the first times that this is actually painted as happening and taking place in Faizabad under the auspices of Shuja-ud-Daula. And this, of course, extraordinary painting of Tilly Kettle was hugely influential in Awadh at this time. It was the first time an oil portrait was painted of these nawabs. It must have been very startling for the nawabs themselves to see themselves so realistically painted. Until then, those of you will be familiar of the usual Mughal-style profile paintings of all the elite members of the court. Here we have an image, a full-length image of both these men, which is really quite striking and which had a huge influence on the local painters as well. Here we have a painting which is, so it's no longer Gentil. This is probably commissioned by the Nawab himself, and we see Faizabad being described in painting as this extraordinary place of, gleaming white terraces, pavilions, a place of beauty, a place where art and culture is being celebrated. But in the background, something altogether different is happening. Art historian Kavita Singh has described this beautifully, and she said if you look in the background, in the very far distance, which I have cropped out on the top and shown a slightly enlarged image of it, you actually see a line of soldiers with an imperial presence riding off to war. And she suggested, and I think that's completely true, that denotes the Mughal emperor and his troublesome presence, always wanting to be fighting, always wanting to find somebody to fight under his banner, somebody to give money and to fight with him. So the painter, I think very cleverly understanding the mood in Awadh, has put this presence, this troublesome presence, very far in the background, away from the beautiful terrace gardens of Faizabad. Yet another one, which is, I just find these paintings endlessly fascinating. Of course, they were criticized a great deal by some of the European scholars who found that this lack of perfect perspective was very troubling and that this was no way in which to draw realistic paintings. But again, Kavita Singh and a number of other scholars have shown that this is actually interpretive work. You have to understand the messages, the codes that are being transmitted to the viewer, codes that would have been very well understood by an elite audience. This is just a photograph of Faizabad today, just to show you that all empires must end. And today, unfortunately, these beautiful, beautiful pavilions and gardens lie in quite terrible disrepair, though you can still see some of the remaining influence in these beautiful structures. Again, a painting to show you how Indian artists reacted to the oil paintings, to the European paintings. So they took a few elements. They took things like depth, like perspective. You can see in the cloaks that Shuja-ud-Daula is wearing, you can almost see the 3D element of it. You can see the shadows, drawn with a great deal of expertise now compared to the earlier 18th century one. But the painter has preferred not to show Shuja-ud-Daula starkly alone without any of the paraphernalia of his glory. He has preferred to show him with an elephant in the background, with some servants holding, the fly whisk, and all of the other attributes that you would have for an elite man like him. Also two beautiful girls, what can I say? You see that, interpret that as you will. Apparently Shuja-ud-Daula was a great connoisseur of beautiful women, and his wonderful mustaches were irresistible to a lot of ladies. And this is a very interesting painting. We won't have time to talk about it at length, but it shows the 1784 visit of Warren Hastings, Governor General Warren Hastings, to Awadh at this time, under the rule of Asaf-ud-Daula, the son of Shuja-ud-Daula. And what is interesting to me, and I show this in my book, you know, if you have the time to read it, is that behind this painting, why does Hastings come to Asaf-ud-Daula? He's being called back to England. He's going to face a trial for impeachment at this point. His career is over. What is he doing here in Awadh? He has been brought to this stage by two women and their eunuchs. And this is a story which we have completely forgotten. It is Bahu Begum and Nawab Begum who stood up to Hastings with such temerity, such fiery decisiveness and belief in their own ability and right to rule Awadh, helped by their eunuchs, the Khwaja Saras, who helped them gather an army to their name, that he had no choice by the end of it to come and basically beg of them that they would forgive him. And then he was recalled to England at this point and faced a trial. But not before he gives us his recipe for kebab, which I knew William would be interested in. So I have it here, just to show you the kind of things that interest us when we are writing history, the kind of things that interest people. I wanted to see the human side of Hastings, and he was very seduced by this young man on the left, who was the son of Shah Alam II, Jawan Bakht. He was his eldest son and heir, and he too came to Awadh looking for help from the great nawabs, saying, we really need help. We are practically prisoners in Old Delhi. There's nobody to fight in our name. Will you come and help us? And this young man, Hastings is completely seduced by the idea of this young man, this scion of Akbar, Jahangir, all these great Mughal figures. He is actually coming on bended knee to ask for help from the British, from Asaf-ud-Daula. So he's absolutely charmed by this episode, so much so that he writes, he notes down the recipe for kebabs that he enjoyed, particularly during his stay at Lucknow, which became incredibly popular on social media. I mean, it has been my most popular post. You know, I thought nothing of it. I still meet people saying, that recipe, we tried it out. And finally, the losers don't always, have nothing to say. Sometimes they have the last laugh. And this is a satirical image painted by a Frenchman showing Hyder Ali giving the British a good spanking. In the background is a Frenchman egging them on and giving them the dandas with which to spank the British. So I will leave it on that. Thank you so much for your time.
You've brought to us two wonderful texts, which very few people were using before you translated them. Tell us briefly about both of them. We start with Jean-Claude de Lauriston, a Scotsman who made the great mistake of leaving Scotland and going to France after losing, or his father lost a duel in Edinburgh. And then the wonderful Compte de Modave, who's one of the, if you haven't read this text, it's one of the, I'd say probably the greatest travelogue. The Voyage en Inde is the greatest travelogue of the 18th century, full of colour, humour, and Enlightenment learning. And he's very, very unimpressed by the English, which will probably go down very well here. So as a Scotsman, I look on neutrally here. Gurjit, tell us about these two books. Yeah. I'm afraid we've slightly overrun, so we've got 7 or 8 minutes.
First of all, thank you, all the JLF family, and of course, William Dalrymple himself, because it was William who introduced me to the Count of Modave, about whom I had only come across a few stray references in a few books. It was at his suggestion. He told me that a copy was available now, a printed copy, and then I was able to procure it and then go ahead with the translation. But before I came to the Count of Modave, I had done another translation of Jean-Claude de Lauriston, who was a Frenchman posted at Murshidabad. There was a small French station at Murshidabad, a kind of outpost of the main station at Chandranagar. At the end of the 7 Years' War, it was a complete walkover in Bengal for the English. The French were totally defeated, and the only fight put up was at Chandarnagar, and then everywhere they surrendered. But since Jean Law was posted at Saidabad, which was right next to the capital, the seat of the Nawab of Bengal, he decided that he would not surrender. First, he was thinking of trying to support Siraj-ud-Daula, but before anything would happen, Siraj-ud-Daula was also defeated and killed. But then Jean Law retreated inland, further up the river. First, he went to Allahabad. Then from Allahabad, he proceeded to Lucknow. And then from Lucknow to Delhi. And he says he was totally astonished by the attitude of the leading French nobles or leading Indian nobles at the court of Lucknow and in Delhi. They had not the slightest idea about who exactly Clive, etc. were. They thought that Clive had been a person hired by the Jagat Seths of Bengal because they had a grievance against the English and they wanted to get rid of Siraj-ud-Daula. So he did his best to convince them. He was hoping that they would encourage him and take him in their service so that he could help to build up a second front against the English and reconquer Bihar, if not Bengal. The Count of Modave, and later on, but he was totally failed to convince anybody. Then he returned back towards Bengal. On the way, he ran again into the Prince Ali Gauhar, who would later become Shah Alam. Ali Gauhar had to flee Delhi because he felt that his life was in danger. The emperor at that time was Alamgir II, an old man, quite feeble in mind as well as in body. And his predecessor was the Emperor Ahmad Shah. He had already been murdered by the Wazir, and now, some years later, within a couple of years, in fact, of his flight of Ali Gauhar, Alamgir too would also be murdered by him. But he joined up with Ali Gauhar somewhere in Bihar. For about 7-8 months, they went together. They tried to capture. 2 attacks were made on the city of Patna, but unfortunately they failed, and eventually he had to surrender. Now the Count of Modave comes almost 10 years after Jean Law. He came to make his fortune. Stories of the tremendous success and the riches gained by Robert Clive and the other English generals had spread like wildfire in Europe, and every Frenchman in the East, because there were only Frenchmen and the English left in India, was hoping to emulate Clive and make a fortune. Now, Modave had earlier spent some time in Mauritius, then known as Ile-de-France. There he had started a plantation, lost money, and then he thought he would go to Bengal and start trading and make money there. He goes to Bengal, spends a few months there, and then decides to go on to Awadh, where he has heard stories of Shuja-ud-Daula, who was that time the Subedar of Awadh, and Jean-Baptiste Gentil was already there working for him in his service with a few hundred Frenchmen around him. But when he goes to Lucknow, first to Faizabad, then to Lucknow, then unfortunately Shuja tells him that the pressure of the English was very great, that there was no chance that they would allow him to serve him in Lucknow. it would be a better idea for him to go to Delhi and work for the emperor. Or under Najaf Khan, who was the deputy prime minister of the emperor. Now, there is one thing very peculiar about India at this stage. The emperor was the emperor of India, Shah Alam, but as Ira has already told you, he was a toothless emperor who had virtually no power and no money, because the treasuries of India had been totally emptied, first by Nadir Shah in 1739 and later in the subsequent invasions by Ahmad Shah Abdali. So Shuja-ud-Daula was actually was appointed Prime Minister of India by Ahmad Shah in the absence of the emperor, who was at that time a refugee in Bihar and later virtually a prisoner in Allahabad. So Shuja, although nominally Prime Minister of India, he never bothered to even visit Delhi or pay his respects. He performed whatever duties were to be required to be performed by the Prime Minister, mainly his signatures on various things, were delegated by him to a deputy who was Mirza Najaf Khan, and who also commanded the armies of the emperor, whatever little armies there were. Now, when Modave comes on the scene, he makes such very interesting observations about the whole thing. And he understands that the British are going to swallow up all this area. Awadh was next on the target, and eventually Delhi would be taken. Though he keeps on thinking, romanticizing about the possibility of making a kind of confederation of princes, rallying them under the emperor, who still command, at least on paper and in words, commanded the loyalty of all the princes of India, and then throwing the English out. But he is convinced that the English are out to swallow everything, which is completely contrary to the usual story which we were told when we were studying history in school, at high school, and even in college to some extent. That time, the usual view of Indian history during the British period was that the British had come here, like the French and the Portuguese earlier, basically to trade. They had no imperial ambitions. Conquest was very far from their dreams. But the prevailing anarchy in this country was such that they were forced to raise armies to defend themselves. In this connection, I'm reminded also of what my father used to tell me about his days in Lahore when he was a student doing his BA in the around about 1930. Their professor of English in their college, on the first day he came to class, he wrote up one sentence on the blackboard. What was in India before the British? A country of bloodshed and misery. So this is what we were taught. India was in a total mess, and the British came and sorted out the mess. And then there was this interesting Victorian historian called J.R. Seeley, who was very influential in the late period. He also propagated this view in a little more sophisticated manner. At one place he says, nothing great that has ever been done by an Englishman was done intentionally, so accidentally as the conquest of India. Later on he continues to say, and thus we founded our empire, partly maybe out of an empty ambition of conquest, and partly out of a philanthropic desire to put an end to enormous evils.
Gurjit, we're going to have to wrap it up.
Yeah. But then there was an Englishman also at that time called Alexander Doe, who wrote a very interesting history He was not very popular in India. Most of the Englishmen detested him. He was nominally a servant of the East India Company, but the last years he devoted to writing his history. And in the end, to which he suggested that while talking about Bengal, the princes whom we raised in Bengal, that is the successors of Mir Jafar, vanished imperceptibly from their thrones, light and unsubstantial as a show of power, as in derision we invested them. They disappeared like Romulus, but without a storm. Now the three governors which followed Mir Jafar, one of them lasted for 1 year, 7 months, another for 1 year, 8 months, another for 2 years, 3 months. And then came in the last one, Asaf-ud-Daula, who lasted for more than 28 years. But during that period of 7-8 years, Bengal, the administration of Bengal had been completely usurped by the East India Company, and the emperor and the governor of Bengal, the Nawab Nazam of Bengal as he was known, was rendered totally a pageant Nawab who only received a pension, which was not very different from the position of the emperor in Delhi, who was at that time basically a pensioner of the Marathas. But the amazing thing, which earlier has been pointed out by Ira also, nobody ever challenged the legitimacy of the Mughal house. There was no rebellion by any Indian prince challenging the basic authority of the emperor, Shah Alam, even though he was a totally helpless person with no power at all. Even the Marathas, when they came, Mahaji Sindhya, he became the regent of the emperor after the in the year 1782, he became the regent. He was the one who had brought Shah Alam in the first place from Allahabad to Delhi. Then after a gap of 3 years, he was again called by the emperor and then to assume the regency. And then he continued to reign rule until 1803. He and his son, successor later on, but merely as deputies of a pageant emperor.
Gurjit, thank you so much for that. This is one of the least written and most fascinating periods of Indian history, when the Mughals are going down, the Marathas are rising up, and the English and the East India Company, this corporate power run by shareholders far away in London, is flexing its muscles like a bunch of tech bros in Silicon Valley ready to take over the world. I strongly recommend to you all these books. The Lion and the Lily by Ira, the wonderful translations that Gurjit has done of both Jean-Claude de Lauriston and the Compte de Modave. They are fascinating, fascinating texts. And there is a whole world waiting to be discovered there. Very little of this is known. So please, a big round of applause to both these pioneering scholars.